I was elbow-deep in garden soil when Brenda Morrison appeared at my fence with a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. Her lips pressed into that distinctive line that promised nothing but trouble for my Tuesday afternoon. "Xavier Zimmerman, we need to talk about this violation," she announced, not bothering with pleasantries as her manicured finger jabbed toward my thriving vegetable garden that stretched across my front yard in Riverside, California. I stood up slowly, brushing dirt from my jeans, and squinted at her through the afternoon sun. "What violation would that be, Brenda?" "This entire garden is a direct violation of Section 7.3 of the Riverside Meadows HOA covenant. Front yards are designated for ornamental landscaping only. Vegetables and produce cultivation are strictly prohibited in areas visible from the street." I wiped my hands on a rag and walked closer to the white picket fence that separated my property from the sidewalk. "You're joking, right? I've been growing vegetables here for 3 months. Where was the HOA then?" Brenda's expression remained frozen in that practiced look of authority that HOA board presidents must learn at some special school for busybodies. "The complaint was filed 2 weeks ago. I've been conducting my investigation since then. These tomatoes, zucchini, peppers, and what appears to be butternut squash are all in clear violation. You have 14 days to remove them and restore the area to approved landscaping." "Investigation?" I couldn't help the laugh that escaped. "Brenda, it's a garden. People can see it from space probably. What exactly were you investigating?" Her jaw tightened. "Mr. Zimmerman, this is not a laughing matter. The HOA covenants exist to maintain property values and community standards. Your vegetable garden, while admittedly well-maintained, sets a precedent we cannot allow. What if everyone decided to turn their front yards into farms? Then we'd all have fresh vegetables, and wouldn't that be terrible?" I said, knowing sarcasm wouldn't help but unable to stop myself. "Look, I read the covenants when I bought this place last year. There's nothing specific about vegetables. It says lawns should be maintained and landscaping should be neat. My garden is both of those things." Brenda flipped through papers on her clipboard with aggressive efficiency. "Section 7.3, subsection B clearly states that front yard landscaping must consist of ornamental plants, decorative elements, and turf grass. Edible gardens fall under the category of agricultural use, which is prohibited in residential zones." "That's a stretch, and you know it," I said, feeling my own frustration building. "I'm not running a farm here. It's a home garden. Half the houses in this neighborhood have fruit trees in their front yards. Are you going to make them cut those down too?" "Fruit trees were grandfathered in as they existed prior to the 2018 covenant revision," Brenda replied without missing a beat. She had an answer for everything, probably rehearsed this whole conversation in her mirror that morning. "Your garden was installed in March of this year, well after current regulations took effect." I glanced back at my garden, at the tomato plants heavy with ripening fruit, the zucchini that had exploded into productivity like they always do, the pepper plants I'd carefully nurtured from seeds. 3 months of work, 3 months of watching something grow and thrive because I'd put in the effort to make it happen. "Who complained?" I asked. "That information is confidential." "Of course it is," I turned back to her. "And what happens if I don't remove it?" Brenda's expression shifted into something that might have been satisfaction, though she tried to hide it. "Daily fines of $100 begin on day 15. If the violation remains after 30 days, the fine increases to $250 per day. The HOA also reserves the right to enter your property and remove the offending landscaping at your expense. You charge me for destroying my own garden. We'd charge you for the labor required to bring your property into compliance, yes." I stared at her for a long moment, trying to process the absurdity of the situation. Brenda, be real with me for just a second. Does this actually make sense to you? I'm growing food, healthy food. The garden looks beautiful. I've had 3 neighbors tell me they love walking past it. Who does this hurt? For just a moment, something flickered across her face. Maybe doubt, maybe discomfort, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. The rules exist for a reason, Xavier. If we allow exceptions, the entire system falls apart. I don't make the rules, I just enforce them. Right, I said. You're just following orders. That's never been a problematic stance in history. Her face reddened. You have 14 days. Good afternoon. She turned on her heel and marched back toward her white SUV parked on the street. I stood there watching her drive away, then turned to look at my garden again. The late afternoon sun cast everything in golden light. The tomatoes were starting to turn red. I'd been planning to harvest the first batch this weekend, maybe make sauce, share some with my neighbor Patricia who'd been so excited about them. Instead of harvesting, I was going to have to fight. I went inside and pulled up the HOA covenants on my laptop. I'd read them when I bought the house, but that was back when I was focused on whether I could paint my front door blue and whether sheds were allowed in backyards. Garden restrictions hadn't been on my radar because who restricts gardens? Brenda was technically right about Section 7.3, subsection B. The language was vague enough that she could interpret it to mean vegetables were prohibited. But it was also vague enough that I could argue vegetables were ornamental plants. Have you seen a bell pepper plant in full production? That's decorative as hell. I spent the evening researching. Turns out, HOA garden disputes were increasingly common across America. Some states had passed laws protecting homeowners' rights to grow food. California had AB 2561, passed back in 2020, which limited HOA's ability to prohibit vegetable gardens in backyards. But front yards, that was murkier legal territory. The next morning, I called a real estate attorney named Marcus Chen, whose website suggested he specialized in HOA disputes. His receptionist scheduled me for Thursday afternoon. In the meantime, I did what any reasonable person in 2025 would do. I posted about it on social media. The HOA says my vegetable garden is illegal, I wrote, attaching photos of my thriving front yard garden. Apparently tomatoes are too offensive for public viewing in Riverside Meadows. They want me to tear it all out and replace it with grass. Because nothing says property values like water-wasting lawns in California, right? The post got modest engagement at first. A few friends commented with outrage and support. Patricia from next door shared it in a local Riverside community group. Then someone else shared it to a California gardening forum. By Wednesday afternoon, it had been picked up by a local news blogger who ran a story with the headline "Riverside HOA Wages War on Vegetables." That's when things got interesting. Thursday morning, a reporter from the Riverside Press Enterprise called me. Her name was Diana Lai, and she sounded genuinely fascinated by the story. "Is it true the HOA is threatening to fine you $100 a day for growing tomatoes?" she asked after introducing herself. "Tomatoes, zucchini, peppers, squash, some herbs," I confirmed. Anything edible is apparently offensive to community standards. But ornamental plants are fine. Ornamental plants are encouraged. I could plant roses that require twice as much water and maintenance, and that would be perfectly acceptable. Deanna asked more questions about the timeline, the specific covenant language, and whether other homeowners had faced similar issues. I told her I didn't know about other homeowners, but I'd be shocked if I was the only one growing vegetables in a neighborhood of 200 homes. "Would you mind if I came by to take some photos?" she asked. "Come on over," I said. She arrived an hour later with a photographer. Deanna was in her 30s, professionally dressed but with dirt under her fingernails that suggested she might be a gardener herself. "Wow," she said when she saw the garden. "This is what they're upset about. It's gorgeous." The photographer started taking pictures from various angles while Deanna interviewed me in front of the tomato plants. We talked about why I'd started the garden, what I grew, how much time it took to maintain. "I work from home as a software developer," I explained. "I spend all day staring at screens. The garden is my way of staying connected to something real, something that grows because I take care of it. Plus, fresh vegetables are amazing." "How much money have you saved on groceries?" I hadn't actually calculated it. "Probably $100 a month, maybe more. Tomatoes alone cost a fortune at the store, and I'm getting pounds of them." "So the HOA wants you to spend more money to maintain a grass lawn that uses more water, costs more to maintain, and provides zero food value, all in the name of property values." That about sums it up. Diana's article ran Friday morning, complete with beautiful photos of my garden. The headline read, "HOA tells homeowner his vegetable garden hurts property values. He disagrees." The article went viral. By Friday afternoon, I had 3 TV stations calling me. My social media post had been shared thousands of times. Someone started a petition on Change.org demanding the Riverside Meadows HOA change its covenant to allow vegetable gardens. The petition got 5,000 signatures in 6 hours. My Thursday meeting with Marcus Chen had been productive. He'd reviewed the covenants and agreed the language was ambiguous enough to fight. "The problem is legal fees," he'd explained. "Even if you win, fighting the HOA in court could cost you $10,000 to $15,000. The HOA has insurance that covers their legal expenses. You don't. So they can just bully people because fighting back is too expensive. Unfortunately, that's often how it works." Marcus had leaned back in his chair, studying me. "But there's another approach. California Civil Code Section 4340 requires HOAs to hold open meetings where homeowners can address the board. You could show up, make your case, and try to get the board to change their interpretation of the covenant." "You think that would work?" "Probably not," he'd admitted. "But it costs nothing to try, and it creates a record that helps if you do end up in court. Show that you made a good faith effort to resolve this reasonably." So Friday evening, I checked the HOA website for the next board meeting schedule. Turned out there was one Monday night. Perfect timing. The weekend brought more media attention. A local TV station came by Saturday morning. The reporter, a young guy named Ryan who was clearly excited to be covering something more interesting than traffic accidents, interviewed me about the dispute. "Have you heard anything from the HOA since this story went public?" Ryan asked. "Not a word," I said. "The 14-day notice is still running. I have until next Tuesday before the fines start." "What will you do if they actually start fining you?" "Honestly, I'm still figuring that out." "Fight it somehow. This is ridiculous." The segment aired on Saturday Evening News. Sunday morning, I woke up to find my phone flooded with messages. Someone had created a GoFundMe to help with legal expenses. It had already raised $3,000. I felt overwhelmed and grateful and angry all at once. This was supposed to be about a garden. It had turned into this whole thing because an HOA wanted to flex its authority over something that harmed literally no one. Sunday afternoon, Patricia knocked on my door. She was in her 70s, had lived in the neighborhood for 20 years, and had been my favorite neighbor since I'd moved in. "I'm coming to that board meeting Monday," she announced. "I'm going to tell them they're being ridiculous. You don't have to do that. Oh, I absolutely do. I've been on the fence about the HOA for years. This is it. This is where they've crossed the line from annoying to tyrannical. She gestured at my garden. You've done something beautiful here. The only thing offensive about it is that the rest of us are lazy and haven't done the same thing. Monday evening, I arrived at the Riverside Meadows Community Center 20 minutes before the board meeting was scheduled to start. The parking lot was already full. I had to park on the street. The meeting room could probably hold 50 people comfortably. There were at least 100 people crammed inside, with more standing in the hallway. News cameras were set up in the back. This was not the typical HOA board meeting attendance. Brenda Morrison stood at the front table with 4 other board members, all looking like they'd rather be literally anywhere else. Her eyes widened when she saw the crowd, then narrowed when she spotted me. "This meeting will come to order," she announced, slamming a gavel. "I need to remind everyone that this is a formal HOA board meeting. Public comment is limited to 3 minutes per person, and only during the designated public comment period." "When's the public comment period?" someone shouted. "After we complete the regular agenda items," Brenda said stiffly. The regular agenda items took forever. Budget reports, landscaping contract renewals, pool maintenance discussions. The crowd grew restless. People were checking their phones, shifting in their seats, whispering. The board members looked increasingly uncomfortable. Finally, 45 minutes in, Brenda announced, "We'll now open the floor for public comment. Please state your name and address clearly for the record." 30 hands shot up. The first speaker was Patricia. She walked to the front slowly, using her cane, and when she turned to address the room, her voice was clear and strong. "I'm Patricia Henderson, 2847 Meadowbrook Drive. I've lived in this neighborhood for 20 years. I've watched this HOA do a lot of questionable things in that time, but telling Xavier Zimmerman to destroy his beautiful garden might be the stupidest yet." Scattered applause. "That garden has brought more joy to this neighborhood than any of the bland landscaping the rest of us have. People walk their dogs past it specifically to see it. I've had 3 conversations with strangers about it. It's community building in action. And you want to kill it because it doesn't fit your narrow definition of appropriate. Shame on you." She sat down to solid applause. Brenda's jaw was so tight I thought her teeth might crack. The next speaker was a man in his 40s who lived 3 streets over. "Jeff Morrison, no relation," he said, pointing at Brenda. Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. "I'm a landscape architect. I work with native plants and sustainable gardening. Xavier's garden is better for the environment than 90% of the landscaping in this neighborhood. It uses less water, provides habitat for pollinators, and looks fantastic. The HOA should be encouraging this, not punishing it." Speaker after speaker got up. Some were neighbors I'd never met. Some had driven from other parts of Riverside because they'd seen the news coverage. A few were members of local gardening clubs who spoke about food security and sustainability. One woman stood up and said, "I'm Jennifer Walsh. I live in a different HOA in Riverside. They tried to do the same thing to me last year. I had to spend $8,000 in legal fees fighting it. I won eventually, but it took 6 months and nearly broke me financially. What you're doing to Xavier is legal bullying, and it's wrong." Not everyone was on my side. 3 people spoke in favor of the HOA's position. They talked about property values and uniform appearance and how allowing vegetables would open the door to all sorts of problems. "If we let him grow tomatoes, what's next?" one man argued. "Chickens, goats, you have to draw the line somewhere." "The line is common sense," someone shouted back. "Tomatoes aren't goats," Brenda banged her gavel. "Order, we will have order." When public comment finally ended after 90 minutes, Brenda looked exhausted. The board will take all comments under advisement. We'll discuss this matter in our next closed session and issue a formal response within 30 days. 30 days. I stood up without thinking. The fine starts in 1 day. I need an answer before that. The 14-day notice has been issued, Brenda said, not meeting my eyes. The process moves forward according to the timeline in your notice. So you're going to fine me while you take your time deciding if you're wrong. My voice was louder than I intended. That's the plan, the crowd erupted. People were shouting questions and objections. News cameras were recording everything. The other board members were leaning toward Brenda, trying to have a whispered conversation over the noise. Finally, one of them, a middle-aged man whose name tag read Robert Chen, Vice President, grabbed the microphone. The board will convene an emergency closed session immediately following this meeting, he announced. We'll have an answer regarding the Zimmerman property by end of business tomorrow. Brenda looked like she wanted to argue, but the room's mood was clearly against her. She nodded stiffly. The meeting adjourned. People came up to me, offering support, sharing their own HOA horror stories, asking about my garden techniques. Deanna Lai from the press enterprise was there, taking notes. The TV cameras wanted statements. I was exhausted and exhilarated and still angry. I gave a brief statement to the cameras about hoping the board would do the right thing, then escaped to my car. Tuesday morning, I worked from home like usual, but I couldn't concentrate. I kept checking my email, my phone, waiting for communication from the HOA. At 2:47 p.m., an email arrived from Brenda Morrison with the subject line, Property Violation Notice 2851 Meadowbrook Drive. I opened it with shaking hands. Dear Mr. Zimmerman, after careful review and consideration of community input, the Riverside Meadows HOA Board of Directors has voted to suspend enforcement action regarding the front yard garden at your property. The board will be conducting a comprehensive review of Section 7.3 of the Community Covenants over the next 60 days to clarify language regarding edible landscaping. During this review period, no fines or enforcement actions will be taken regarding your current garden. You will be notified of any covenant amendments following the review process. Sincerely, Brenda Morrison, HOA President. I read it 3 times. It wasn't exactly an apology or an admission they'd been wrong, but it was a stay of execution for my garden. I called Marcus Chen to tell him the news. That's a win, he said. Not a complete victory, but definitely a win. They're backing down. For now, I said. What happens in 60 days depends on what they decide. But here's the thing, this story has gotten big enough that they're going to be very careful. If they try to reinstate the violation after all this publicity, it'll look terrible. My guess. They'll amend the covenant to allow vegetable gardens with some restrictions, size limits, maintenance requirements, that kind of thing. He was half right. The 60-day review period was interesting. The HOA scheduled 3 community input sessions to discuss potential covenant amendments. I attended all of them. The first one was awkward. Brenda ran it like a hostage negotiation, clearly unhappy about the whole thing. But the community turnout was significant. About 40 homeowners showed up, and most were supportive of allowing edible gardens. A few concerns were raised. One woman worried that vegetable gardens would attract pests. Someone else worried about the visual appearance if people let their gardens get overgrown or didn't maintain them properly. Those are fair concerns, I said when given a chance to speak. But they apply to any landscaping. You can have an ugly rose garden or a beautiful vegetable garden. The issue is maintenance standards, not the type of plants. By the second community session, the conversation had shifted. People were bringing photos of their own gardens, some hidden in backyards where the HOA couldn't complain. A coalition was forming around the idea of updating the covenants to explicitly allow edible landscaping throughout the community, front and backyards, with the same maintenance standards as ornamental landscaping. Brenda fought it the entire way, but she was outnumbered. Even the other board members had started to shift. Robert Chen, the vice president, admitted in the third session that his wife had been wanting to install a raised bed vegetable garden for years, but had been afraid of HOA retaliation. "This has made me realize how unnecessarily restrictive we've been," he said. "We should be encouraging people to use their property in ways that make them happy, as long as they're not hurting anyone else." The amendment passed with 72% of homeowners voting in favor. The new language explicitly allowed edible landscaping in front and backyards, with requirements that gardens be maintained in a neat and orderly fashion, free from weeds, and using appropriate structures like raised beds or clear borders. My garden was legal, but the story doesn't end there. About a week after the amendment passed, I got another email from the HOA. This one wasn't from Brenda, it was from Robert Chen. "Xavier, I hope this message finds you well. I wanted to reach out personally regarding a matter the board has been discussing. As you may know, the HOA maintains several common areas throughout the neighborhood, including the entrance gardens, the area around the community center, and the parkway strips along Meadowbrook Drive. These areas are currently landscaped with traditional ornamental plants and require significant maintenance, water, and expense. Given your expertise with edible landscaping and the success of your front yard garden, the board would like to discuss the possibility of converting some of these common areas to include vegetable gardens. We would hire you as a consultant to design and potentially maintain these spaces. Would you be interested in discussing this further? Regards, Robert Chen." I stared at the email for a full minute, then started laughing. They wanted to pay me. The HOA that had threatened to fine me $100 a day for my illegal garden now wanted to hire me to install gardens in their common areas. I called Robert that evening. "Is this for real?" I asked. "Completely for real," he said. "Look, the board has been doing a lot of reflection about this whole situation. Brenda is actually stepping down as president at the end of her term. She's burned out, and honestly, I think this whole thing took something out of her. I'm likely taking over. And I want to move the community in a different direction." "What kind of direction?" "More sustainable, more community-focused. We spend about $30,000 a year on landscaping for common areas. Most of that is water costs and maintenance of plants that serve no purpose except looking green. What if we converted half those spaces to productive gardens? We could donate the produce to local food banks, or have a community harvest day where residents can take what they need. We'd save money on landscaping, use less water, and actually contribute something meaningful." I had to admit, it sounded interesting. "And you want me to design this and maintain it if you're willing. We'd pay you what we're currently paying the landscaping company for those areas. Probably around $1,500 a month for 20 hours of work." That was more than fair. "What about Brenda?" "She's okay with this," Robert laughed. "Brenda doesn't get a veto anymore. The board votes on decisions, and I've already talked to the other members. They're all supportive. This is happening if you want it to happen." I thought about it for about 30 seconds. "Let's do it." Over the next 3 months, I worked with Robert and a committee of interested residents to design the community garden spaces. We started with the entrance to the neighborhood, a large area that had been filled with thirsty roses and decorative grasses. I designed raised beds in an attractive pattern, using cedar wood that would last for years. We planted tomatoes, peppers, squash, cucumbers, herbs, even some berry bushes along the borders. The design was both functional and beautiful edible landscaping at its finest. The community center got a larger treatment. We installed multiple raised beds and created designated plots that residents could sign up to maintain. Within a week of announcing the program, all 20 plots were claimed. People were excited. The work was physical and time-consuming, but I loved it. After years of sitting at a computer all day, having an excuse to be outside, working with soil and plants, getting paid for it, this was an unexpected gift. The first harvest happened in late summer. We organized a community event where residents could come pick produce from the common area gardens. Over 100 people showed up. Kids were running between the beds, picking cherry tomatoes and eating them straight off the vine. Adults were filling bags with peppers and zucchini. Someone brought a grill and started cooking vegetables on the spot. Patricia found me near the tomato plants. "This is what a community should be," she said. "People together, sharing something good. You did this." "The HOA did this," I said. "I just grew some vegetables." She laughed. "The HOA tried to fine you for growing vegetables. You forced them to see how wrong they were. There's a difference." Local news covered the community harvest event. Deanna Lai wrote a follow-up article with the headline, "From Violation to Victory: How One Man's Garden Transformed an HOA." The story got picked up by some national outlets. I did a phone interview with a reporter from the Washington Post about HOA reform and food security. But the most satisfying moment came in early fall. I was working in the community center garden, training some new volunteers on proper pruning techniques, when Brenda Morrison walked up. I hadn't spoken to her since the board meeting where everything exploded. "Xavier," she said quietly, "do you have a moment?" I stood up, brushing dirt off my knees. "Sure." She looked older than I remembered, tired. "I wanted to apologize for how I handled the situation with your garden. I was wrong. I hadn't expected that." "Okay. I've been president of this HOA for 6 years," she continued. "I took the role seriously, maybe too seriously. I thought my job was to enforce the rules, to maintain standards, to keep everything controlled. But I lost sight of why those rules existed in the first place. Why do they exist? To make the community better, to help people live well together." She gestured at the garden around us. "This makes the community better. Your garden made the community better." I was so focused on the letter of the rules that I missed the point entirely. "That's easy to do," I said, and I meant it. "Systems make people rigid. You were doing what you thought was right." "I was doing what was easy," she corrected. "Enforcing rules is easy. Thinking about whether the rules make sense is harder. Admitting you're wrong is hardest of all." She paused. "Robert is going to be a good president, better than I was. He sees possibilities where I saw problems." "You created those possibilities," I said, "by backing down. You could have dug in and fought. It would have been ugly and expensive for everyone, but you didn't. You listened. That matters." She gave me a small smile. "Well, thank you for that kindness." She turned to leave, then turned back. "The garden is beautiful, by the way, your front yard. I walk past it sometimes in the evening. It really is beautiful." After she left, I stood there for a while, thinking about how strange life could be. 6 months ago, I'd been facing daily fines and the destruction of something I'd built with my own hands. Now I was being paid to build more of them. The gardens flourished. By the end of the year, the HOA common area gardens had produced over 800 pounds of vegetables. We donated most of it to the Riverside Food Bank, keeping some for community events and allowing residents to harvest from the communal beds. The following spring, Robert Chen called me with another proposal. 3 other HOAs in Riverside have reached out asking about our edible landscaping program. They want to do something similar. Would you be interested in consulting for them? That's how I accidentally started a business. By spring of the second year, I was consulting with 7 different HOAs across Riverside and Morno Valley, designing edible landscaping for common areas, teaching workshops on sustainable gardening, and maintaining contracts worth about $5,000 a month. I scaled back my software development work to part-time. The garden consulting was more lucrative and infinitely more satisfying. Patricia loved to joke that I'd found a way to monetize pissing off the HOA. "You should teach a course," she'd say. How to turn a violation notice into a business opportunity. The Riverside Meadows Community Garden became a neighborhood fixture. People brought their kids to learn about where food comes from. Residents who'd never talked to each other before became friends while working side by side in the plots. The food bank partnership expanded, with volunteers from the bank coming to help with harvests. In the third year, the HOA applied for and received a grant from the California Department of Food and Agriculture for urban agriculture education. They used the money to build a small greenhouse at the community center and fund a series of free gardening workshops for residents. I taught most of the workshops. We covered everything from seed starting to composting to pest management. They were always full, with waiting lists. One Saturday morning, I was teaching a workshop on tomato cultivation when I noticed a familiar face in the back row. Brenda Morrison was taking notes. After the workshop, she came up to me. "I'm thinking about converting my backyard," she said. "I have all this grass I never use, seemed like a waste." "That's great," I said. "I'd be happy to help you design something." "I was hoping you'd say that." She pulled out her phone and showed me photos of her yard. I was thinking raised beds along the back fence, maybe some berry bushes on the sides. We talked for 20 minutes about design possibilities, plant selections, and maintenance requirements. It was surreal, in the best possible way. Later that evening, I stood in my front yard, looking at my garden in the fading light. The tomato plants were starting their spring growth. The pepper plants were covered in tiny flowers. The zucchini was preparing for its annual attempt to take over the world. I thought about the violation notice that had started all of this. The threat of fines, the anger and frustration, the media circus. None of it had been fun while it was happening, but it had led to something genuinely good. The garden had given me a new career, new friendships, a sense of purpose I hadn't known I was missing. It had changed the neighborhood for the better. It had even changed Brenda Morrison, though that had taken longer. My phone buzzed with an email. Another HOA inquiry, this one from Corona, asking about converting their entrance landscaping to edible plants. I'd respond tomorrow, probably schedule a consultation for next week. I went inside and made dinner using tomatoes, peppers, and basil from my garden. The food tasted better because I'd grown it myself. That would never get old. The next morning, I drove out to a new consultation in Morno Valley. The HOA president, a woman named Susan Torres, met me at the community center. She was enthusiastic and full of ideas, having read about the Riverside Meadows project online. "We want to do something even bigger," she said as we walked the property. "We have 2 acres of common area that's currently just grass and some sad-looking shrubs. I want to transform it into a real community farm." "That's ambitious," I said. "It would require serious volunteer commitment." "We've already got 50 residents signed up to help," she said. "People are excited about this. They've seen what you did in Riverside Meadows. They want that here." We spent 2 hours walking the property, discussing possibilities. I took measurements, made sketches, asked questions about water access and sun exposure. By the time I left, I had the framework for a design that would include vegetable beds, an orchard of dwarf fruit trees, a pollinator garden, and a composting area. The project would take months to implement and would be the largest thing I'd designed yet. I was excited and nervous in equal measure. That evening, I worked on the design at home, my laptop surrounded by seed catalogs and gardening reference books. This was my life now. This strange, unexpected life that had grown from a single conflict with an HOA that didn't like tomatoes. Over the next few months, the Morno Valley project took shape. We held community workdays where dozens of volunteers showed up to build raised beds, plant trees, install irrigation. Kids painted signs for the different garden areas. Someone donated a shed for tool storage. The Riverside Meadows garden continued to thrive. The spring harvest was even bigger than the previous year. The food bank was thrilled. Residents were proud of what their community had created. I ran into Robert Chen at the grocery store one afternoon. He was in the produce section, looking at the tomatoes with a disappointed expression. "Why would I buy these when we're growing better ones at the community center?" he said when he saw me. "Valid point," I agreed. "I've been thinking," he said. "We should write up a case study about what we did. The process, the results, the challenges. Make it available to other HOAs that want to do something similar." "That's a good idea. Would you co-author it with me? I can handle the administrative and governance side, but I need your expertise on the horticultural aspects." We spent the next month working on the document. It ended up being 30 pages long, covering everything from covenant amendment procedures to garden design principles to community engagement strategies. Robert posted it on the HOA's website as a free resource. Within a week, it had been downloaded over 500 times. We started getting emails from HOAs across California, Nevada, Arizona, even a few from Texas and Florida. The demand for edible landscaping in HOA communities was apparently significant. I started getting more consulting requests than I could handle on my own. That's when I decided to hire help. I brought on 2 other gardeners, both with backgrounds in sustainable agriculture. Together, we formed a small consulting company focused specifically on edible landscaping for HOAs and community organizations. Business was good, really good. We were booking consultations months in advance. Patricia thought the whole thing was hilarious. "You've built a career out of spite," she said one evening when we were both working in our respective gardens. "It's not spite," I protested. "It's more like aggressive optimism. That's just spite with better marketing." Maybe she was right. But spite that resulted in communities growing food and saving money and bringing people together seemed like productive spite at least. In the 4th year, something unexpected happened. The California legislature passed a new law, AB 1771, which explicitly prohibited HOAs from banning edible landscaping in front or backyards. The law was partially inspired by the media coverage of my case and several others like it. I got a call from a legislative aide asking if I'd be willing to testify at a committee hearing about the impact of HOA restrictions on urban agriculture. I testified, talking about my experience and the broader potential for edible landscaping to address food security issues. The law passed with bipartisan support. California became the 3rd state, after Florida and Nevada, to protect homeowners' rights to grow food on their own property. Diana Lai wrote another article about it, with the headline "Garden Dispute Grows into Statewide Reform." She interviewed me about how it felt to have influenced actual legislation. Honestly, I just wanted to grow tomatoes, I told her. I never set out to change any laws, but I'm glad the law changed. It needed to. The article quoted Brenda Morrison, of all people. She'd agreed to an interview reflecting on the original dispute. I was wrong, she said in the article. I see that clearly now. The rules we were enforcing didn't serve the community's best interests. They served an outdated idea of what a neighborhood should look like. I'm glad the state stepped in to prevent other HOAs from making the same mistake we did. That must have been hard for her to say publicly. I respected her for it. As the business grew, I found myself traveling more for consultations. I visited HOAs in San Diego, Sacramento, Fresno. Each community had its own character, its own challenges, its own opportunities. But Riverside Meadows remained my favorite project. It was where everything started, where I'd learned that conflict could be transformed into something constructive if you pushed back against unreasonable restrictions and offered a better alternative. The garden had grown beyond just vegetables now. We'd added a children's educational area with raised beds at kid height, where elementary school classes could come for field trips. We'd installed a rain capture system that provided irrigation water. We'd built a covered pavilion where the gardening workshops were held. It had become a real community hub. On any given weekend, you'd find people working in the plots, kids playing in the designated areas, volunteers leading tours, neighbors just sitting on benches and talking. Patricia was there almost every day, tending her plot and chatting with whoever came by. At 75 now, she moved slower but was as sharp and funny as ever. "This is your legacy," she told me one afternoon. "Not bad for someone who just wanted to grow tomatoes." "The tomatoes are pretty good though," I said. "The tomatoes are spectacular. But the community you built around them is better." In the 5th year, I got an email that surprised me. It was from Brenda Morrison. "Xavier, I hope you're doing well. I wanted to reach out because I've been working on something I think you might be interested in. I've started an organization focused on HOA reform and education. The goal is to help HOA boards govern more effectively and avoid the kind of overreach that caused our conflict. I'm developing training materials and workshops for new board members. Would you be willing to contribute a section on working with residents on community improvements rather than just enforcing restrictions? I think your perspective would be valuable. No pressure if you're not interested, but I wanted to ask. Best regards, Brenda." I read the email twice, then called Robert Chen. "Did you know Brenda was doing HOA reform work?" "Yeah," he said. "She's actually really good at it. She learned a lot from what happened and she's channeling it into helping other boards avoid the same mistakes. It's impressive." I thought about it for a day, then replied to Brenda saying I'd be happy to contribute. We met for coffee the following week at a place in downtown Riverside. She looked different. Happier, maybe. Less rigid. "Thank you for meeting with me," she said. "I know our history is complicated." "Ancient history at this point," I said. "Tell me about this organization." She explained her vision. Training for HOA board members focusing on collaborative governance, understanding when rules actually matter versus when they're just control for control's sake, engaging residents in decision-making. "Most people who end up on HOA boards have no training," she said. "They just try to figure it out, and often they default to rigid enforcement because it's simple. I want to give them better tools." "That's a good mission," I said. We worked together on the training material over the next few weeks. I wrote a section on community improvement projects and how to engage residents in creating value rather than just enforcing compliance. Brenda incorporated it into a larger curriculum about effective HOA governance. She started presenting the training to HOA boards across Southern California. I went with her to a few sessions, sharing the Riverside Meadows story as a case study in how conflicts could become opportunities. It was strange, traveling with Brenda to talk about the dispute we'd had 5 years earlier. But it was also strangely satisfying. We'd both grown from it. We'd both learned things, and now we were trying to help others avoid similar conflicts. One evening after a training session in Orange County, we were driving back to Riverside and Brenda said, "I've never properly apologized for how I treated you." I said sorry, but I don't think I ever really acknowledged how much stress and difficulty I caused you. It worked out okay, I said, but it could have gone differently. If you'd been less financially stable, if you couldn't afford to fight, if the media hadn't picked up the story, I could have ruined something you loved just because I was too rigid to see past the rules. You could have, I agreed, but you didn't. You backed down when you realized you were wrong. That takes strength. It took public humiliation, she said wryly. I wasn't strong enough to do it on my own. Most people aren't. That's why we have communities, media, public pressure, to keep each other honest when we're getting too rigid or too comfortable with power. We drove in silence for a while. Then Brenda said, "I've learned that the best rules are the ones that make space for people to thrive in their own ways, not the ones that force everyone into the same box." That's a good lesson, I said. The business continued to grow. By the 6th year, we had 5 full-time employees and were working with over 30 HOAs across California. We'd expanded services to include not just edible landscaping but general sustainable design, native plant gardens, water conservation systems. The Riverside Meadows Garden was celebrating its 6-year anniversary. The HOA organized a big event with food trucks, live music, and garden tours. Hundreds of people came, including residents from other neighborhoods who'd read about the garden or participated in workshops. I gave a short speech about the garden's history, carefully editing out some of the conflict details since it was a family-friendly event. But I made sure to mention that it had started with a dispute and had transformed into something that brought the community together. Gardens grow, I said. But communities grow too if you give them the right conditions. Sometimes that means challenging rules that don't make sense anymore. Sometimes it means being willing to admit when you're wrong. Always it means being willing to work together towards something better than what you had before. Patricia was in the audience, beaming with pride. Robert Chen was there with his wife and kids. Brenda Morrison stood in the back, applauding. After the speech, a young couple approached me. "We just bought a house in the neighborhood," the woman said. "We chose Riverside Meadows specifically because of the community garden program. We wanted to be part of something like this." That happened more often now. The garden had become a selling point for the neighborhood. Real estate agents mentioned it in listings. Property values, ironically, had gone up. Later that evening, after the event ended and most people had gone home, I walked through the garden alone. The sun was setting, casting everything in golden light again, just like that day 6 years ago when Brenda had shown up with her clipboard and her violation notice. The tomatoes were growing, the peppers were producing, the zucchini was doing its thing. But more than that, there were signs of community everywhere. Hand-painted markers on the plots, a little free library someone had installed near the entrance, a bulletin board covered with photos and notes and recipes. This was what I'd fought for, though I hadn't fully understood it at the time. Not just the right to grow vegetables, but the space for a community to define itself on its own terms, to create value in its own way, to build connections through shared purpose. My phone buzzed with an email. Another HOA consultation request, this one from San Bernardino. I'd respond tomorrow. Tonight, I just wanted to stand in this garden I'd accidentally created and appreciate how strange and wonderful the path had been from violation notice to here. The garden had taught me about resilience, about fighting for things that mattered, about the unexpected ways that conflict could transform into opportunity if you refused to back down from what was right. But mostly, it had taught me about tomatoes, really good tomatoes. The kind you can't buy in stores, the kind that taste like summer and satisfaction, and small victories that grow into bigger ones if you're patient enough to let them. I picked a ripe tomato off a nearby plant, ate it standing there in the fading light, and thought about all the gardens still to be planted, all the HOAs still to be convinced, all the communities waiting to discover what they could grow together if someone just gave them permission to try.